even though, and if we can show another picture, you see there was so much back and forth and so much one affecting the other. There's this picture of Jeremiah that Michelangelo creates, his Jeremiah, and then they use it, if you've got the picture there, or you can see a version of it in the Mantua Haggadah, how they've taken that picture and used it for a Passover Haggadah.
Yes.
That's just sort of like the flipped it in terms of the side, but it's the same.
It shows that they were sharing the same iconic culture.
And they were interacting a lot. The famous picture, which we don't have here, of Moses with his horns was done at that time, and now the scholars don't think that he was trying to disparage the Jews by suggesting they had horns, which was an old idea, because the point of the horns was found to be a mistranslation
of Keren,
of the halo or the aura.
The halo, like when Moses came from the mountain.
The aura or the halo that he had.
Keren aura, a halo of light.
Light, and it was translated as horns.
Because it also means horn.
That's why the mistake was made. You can see, and we know, for instance, that Michelangelo went and consulted the Jews on this when he wanted to do his statue, and he had chats with Jews about quite how he should do it.
Well, I'm kind of a little disappointed that they didn't correct him on that horn.
I don't know. Maybe they didn't. Some of them didn't know themselves, but they should have. But there was so much interconnection, and the reason that these two emissaries had come to Venice, for example, when they took back the Bassano brothers to the court of Henry VIII, is that Henry VIII, in trying to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, had decided that maybe they could find a way out according to biblical law, and he should have never married her, and they could annul it.
He was willing to explore the Jewish law?
And so he sent emissaries to Venice, to the rabbis of Venice, who were considered the greatest rabbis. And again, you can see at the period how much they valued Jewish learning, to try to get these rabbis to weigh in on the subject and give him some ammunition so that the Pope would annul his marriage. Jews were also very, very active in medicine at the time. I mean, the idea of the Jewish doctor is not a new one. As I often say, it wasn't the Jewish mother. It goes a lot further back. And because the exploration of medicine was opening up in the way that everything else was, they turned, of course, to the Jewish doctor, who for centuries, even during the Dark Ages, had been a voice of enlightenment in medical treatment, scientific enlightenment, rather than based on faith. And the clergy knew it. I mean, there wasn't a pope that didn't have his Jewish doctor.
I see.
All through the time when he was telling everybody else to pray for wellness, he was getting,
the best
medical care he could. Yes.
Now, going back to Solomon de Rossi, the great musician, he was writing for his synagogue this music. We heard a little bit of it in the intro. We'll hear a little bit of it in the outro. But tell us about the synagogues. It must have been a very grand synagogue that he was writing for. That cost a lot of money to hire those singers and all that.
Yes, the synagogues were very grand, and anyone who has visited Italy, and particularly Venice, will have seen some of these great synagogues. I think I have to also correct another misconception here, and that is that somebody might be sitting there thinking, well, weren't all the Jews in a ghetto at the time? I mean, all we hear about is ghettos and
That's
Jews
East
in ghettos.
European.
No, it started in Venice, but it started in 1516. But there was a whole huge period when the only place there was a ghetto was in Venice, and the Jews and the Christians, if they didn't live side by side, they lived very much within each other's worlds.
I see. Sort of like the Jews and the Italians in Brooklyn, or
yeah. They were more friendly in this point of time than they would be for a very long time afterwards, because there was the closing down of life for Jews in Italy, and a lot of them left. And you ask why we don't hear a great deal about it.
I did ask that, yes.
And one of the things is that in modern times there were relatively few Jews left in Italy, even though Italy was teeming with Jews from antiquity, from Roman times onwards.
What were the events that caused that?
Well, one was the coming of the ghetto. We think of Jews being herded into a ghetto, But if you think about it and you look at it a little bit more carefully, you'll find that when this happened, and it happened in city after city, started in 1555 with the Pope deciding that it was, he had a papal bull which said it's absurd that the Jews should be allowed to live among the Christians. They're just causing trouble. They're not grateful. We have to make sure they don't participate in regular life the way they have. He was a very anti-Semitic Pope. We think of them being herded into a ghetto, but what actually happened was life had become more and more difficult, and rather than go into the ghetto necessarily and live in terrible circumstances and have your livelihood restricted to awful, you couldn't make any money, a lot of them left.
I see.
And we don't talk about the fact that, that they could, if they could, and they found ways to actually leave Italy rather than decide to live in the ghettos of Italy. So a lot of them left at that time. The Jewish population shrank dramatically. Up until modern times, they were not allowed to live in the Kingdom of Naples. After the middle of the 16th century, they were kicked out of there, and Sicily, where they'd been very numerous. That was part of the Inquisition and the Spanish overlords that ruled that part of the country. So that there was no chance of them interacting with anything else anymore. They were just finished as participants. It's very interesting. In one book that you read about the Jews in the Renaissance, they always say that the Jews never were involved in the art and the architecture. And you never hear about them being involved as great painters or architects. And the reason for that is very interesting. First of all, they really didn't involve themselves in anything as permanent as that. They preferred to illustrate books and so forth. But there were also some that scholars have recently found that they believe were commissioned painters on some of the church murals and great canvases, and they show it by having enlarged the Hebrew writing in various tiny corners and seeing little prayers that they don't think would have been written by a Christian artist.
That's fascinating.
And yet, the argument is that even if they were commissioned to do a lot of this artwork, and then it was put in the name of a Christian artist, perhaps more famous, they wouldn't have wanted, the artist who got the commission wouldn't want it known that one of his atelier, one of his people in his workshop did it, not him. And also the person who did it, the Jew who did it, probably didn't want to broadcast the fact that he had decorated the churches.
Yeah. He was just a mercenary. Yeah.
Well, he was a hired hand.
Yeah.
He was a hired paintbrush, if you will.
Yes. Wow, that's such a fascinating story. Now, you mentioned that there is the printing press that developed in that Renaissance period. How come the printing press didn't serve in recording the history of this period more so than we might expect?
It did, but and certainly the Jews were in the forefront of printing. They were very much in the forefront of printing, and the earliest printed Jewish texts come from this period. They were printed, some of them first in Spain, and then in Italy, and later on in the Ottoman Empire, because they were freer to do this. But Venice was a great center of Jewish printing, and the printing was not done by a Jew because Jews were not allowed to print. It was done by a Christian, Bomberg, who printed on behalf of the Jews, and people said, well, why did he bother? Well, he was paid very well.
Okay, now the church really created circumstances where it was no longer desirable for Jews to live in Italy. Is it fair to say that the church brought the Renaissance to a halt at a certain point in time?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Counter-Reformation, that they call it, because they cracked down on a lot of things because they were losing their power on account of the Protestants rising. And so there was a great crackdown in general. The one thing that I think I would like, if I've got a moment to mention, is the role of the women.
Yes.
The Jewish women, because not only was it a flowering of political thought and philosophy and art and so forth, but it was also a time when the women were allowed to have a lot more say in a lot of more things than they had been before.
Were they emancipated? Could they vote? Could they go down to the city hall and represent
well, the Jews
themselves?
could not vote because they were not ever given citizenship until the late 18th century in most of Europe, so that they wouldn't have been able to vote. Nobody could vote anyway because we didn't have voting at the time. We had, monarchies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Silly me.
So
Right.
I mean,
well,
it wasn't relevant.
could they be part of the? I guess more like the city council.
Could they be representatives?
Yeah.
No, not at that point. Although in the Roman times, Roman Italy, there had been a lot of Jews in government, but that had gone with the Roman Empire. As soon as the Roman Empire became Christianized, that was stopped.